Okay, let's start. It's half past, so very welcome everyone to today's Seedbox event, which is part of the Green Room series of seminars and talks here at Tema. And I'm very happy to also welcome today and to introduce to you our guest, Fiona Cameron. And Fiona is currently a visiting professor at the Department for Studies of Social Change and Culture here at Linköping University, which is Tema Q, right?
Yes.
In Norrköping, the Norrköping campus, not here at Valla. And Fiona is also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University in Australia, which is a university that we collaborate a lot with in the Seedbox. We have had several guests from WSU here during the last years. Fiona has been the recipient of 7 ARC grants and a number of international grants in Germany, Sweden, New Zealand and Canada. She has researched and published widely on museums and their agency in contemporary societies around topics of societal importance, ranging from the agencies of the museum in climate change to material culture, digital heritage, anthropology, and indigenous populations. Her publications include, for example, a multi-author monograph, Collecting, Ordering, Governing at Duke University Press, which was out last year.
Yes.
A sole-authored monograph, Theorizing Digital Data as Heritage at MIT Press, and a co-edited collection, Theorizing Digital Cultural Heritage, MIT Press 2007. Fiona works with a range of theoretical topics, including ontology and the posthumanities, to rework museum practices, which ties in with the title and topic of her lecture here at Seedbox today, under the heading Museum Collections as More Than Human Things, the Case of the Green Plastic Bucket. Once again, welcome. We're very pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Jesper, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak at the Seedbox event. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you. So my work sort of ranges across a number of heritage and museum concerns. My background is as a social history curator, so I sort of work in the interface between institutions and the academic or scholarly world. And I'm particularly interested in theoretical work. And this presentation comes out of the work that I've done around museums and climate change, with a sort of post-humanities angle on museum collections. Now, climate change and the Anthropocene are the unintended consequences of an erroneous and dangerous detachment from our environment and others, and of various forms of exploitation, injustice and inequality founded on the illusion that the human is the centre of all things, a dominant view in the Western world. The newly visible powers and agencies of a more than human world are increasingly apparent, as evident through the escalating bushfire risk in Australia, as we confront the material consequences of advanced capitalism and 2 centuries of industrialisation. Now, these events and situations tell us that the world that we're bound to live in is no longer solely ours, that our human capacities to drive change and control outcomes have been substantially curtailed. And if we're to avoid compounding existing problems and creating new ones, we require new cognitive frames and practices of life that promote respectful ethical thinking and forms of conjoint action that acknowledge our entanglements, shared vulnerabilities and futures, not only with other humans, but with the more than human world. Through their collections and exhibitions, museums are powerful pedagogical institutions, instrumental in shaping ideas about culture, identity and cultural difference, and about human relations with nature, technology and science. They're therefore ideally placed to frame and promote new theories and practices of life. So in an effort to secure more viable futures and a habitable planet, museum scholars and professionals can progress real-world change and scholarly change by first critiquing modern ways of thinking and acting, by reworking familiar humanisms and modern dualisms such as nature-culture, social-natural, subject and object, which is one of the key sort of themes in museum practice, and self and other, that prevent us from thinking in a radically ecological way. Now, you could argue that these dualisms are an ecological way of thinking because they are relational, naturally relational. They're not divisions, but you have to have a relationship between these two binaries. And this reworking can be undertaken through what I call a series of ecologizing experimentations. Museums have the potential to rework the possible relations between things and people through new types of museum practices, interpretive storytelling, communicative strategies, and embodied experiences. Now, my specific goal here through this ecologizing approach, and I outlined this in a manifesto in the co-edited collection Climate Change and Museum Futures, is to promote a relational and more than human ways of thinking and acting using museum collections, exhibition and institutional practices. So here I seek to reconstitute museum-centred concepts and practices based on the human subject and reframe them in a way that has the potential to signal an entangled approach to the makeup and composition of the world. So ecological thinking is no longer the sole domain of the biological sciences through evolutionary thought, for example. Rather, we need to embed ecological thinking across all areas of museum practice. And I also would like to add here that museums embody a range of different ecological thinking. And they, from, for example, evolutionary thought. But we need to think in a more radically interconnected or coexisting existence. In doing so, we have the capacity to promote new ways to represent, talk about humans, non-humans, culture and cultural diversity, heritage collections, the environment and climate change as alternative narratives, sets of practices and concepts. So over the last 10 years, I've been conducting these experimentations across domains of practice, from climate change narratives to institutional forms, to collections and documentation, and also to digital heritage. The theoretical coordinates I draw for reframing or for framing these ecologizing experiments are inspired by anthropologist Bruno Latour's notion of ecologize. For Latour, ecologizing, as opposed to our preoccupation with modernizing, is a political project that seeks to inform new notions of the social by specifying that natural and cultural identities are bound together in complex interactions, and that relational and ecological principles bear on every type of connection. I also refer here in these ecologizing experimentations to the notion of composition as a way of thinking about how we might compose or arrange different museum interpretive worlds and narratives that illustrate the alternative ways that we can entangle ourselves with places, non-humans, technologies, and the material world. But in order to build a world across modern dualisms, we need to first envisage the modern mindset and its idea of the human and the social from the point of view of the relations that hold all these things together. The Natural History Museum in London, for example, is the ongoing operation of the division of nature cultures, human-centeredness and privilege. References to Nature's Treasure House present the museum as an inventory of nature as a domain separate from humans. And this is their branding, that Nature's Treasure House. The new Human Evolutionary Gallery uses collections to illustrate Darwin's nature-culture hybrids and ecological thinking that promotes understandings of the human as an emergent consequence of the exchange of genetic code across species, but it remains human-centred because it views humans as the most evolved primate. While approaches in conservation biology, as seen in the ecology gallery Nature Plus, are more ecological, using specimens to represent the diversity of species, habitats and ecosystems and their interdependence, it is organised around the human notion of the balance of nature. Nature is ideally presented as pure, as a single entity and in balance. Conservation measures are framed on the basis of how far nature has diverged from its pure form. Now, other exhibitions at the Darwin Centre present ecological systems as natural in which humans are absent, and where species are bounded interactive bodies rather than radically interdependent. At the Science Museum in London, the exhibition Atmosphere Exploring Climate Change Signs presents the atmosphere as an object of human intervention rather than an entangled socio-biophysical system. Now, object concepts, modes of collecting, ordering and research are predominantly understood in terms of human subject-object relations, with the exception of Indigenous collections, which is usually an outcome of Indigenous curatorial agency. Even though all these things have always been entangled with the lives, qualities and capacities of non-human actors. For example, cultural collections are gathered and preserved to symbolise human concerns, our attachments to cultural life and society, our social relations, affiliations, institutions and politics. While newer approaches are often more inclusive, acknowledge the subjectivities of previously excluded groups, or illustrate darker histories, these frames continue to promote objects as stable reference, representative of events, of identities, of the past, often denying the other material, discursive, technological, biological, and non-human aspects of these objects' agental status. Even more recent attempts to theorise museums by the new museology uphold the assumption that human societies are naturally divided into a limited number of non-interacting cultural categories defined according to the self and other dualism, and where difference is reduced to a disparity of worldviews. New cognitive frames and practices promoted through ontological and posthumanities scholarship and museum work has the potential to not only challenge the privileging of the human subject, but more importantly can be put to work to put humans back in their ecological place, knitted together and becoming with not just biological species, but all manner of animate and inanimate things, including non-human beings, entities, materials, and earthly processes. These new theories or ontologies focus on histories and events as processes and seek to reinstitute new types of relational and agentic connections between humans, animate life, and non-animate things as part of one dynamic system. And this includes the work of Deleuze and Guattari, Donna Haraway, Jane Bennett, Tim Morton, Bruno Latour, Isabel Stengers, and many others. More recently, an emerging body of scholarship in archaeology, heritage and museum studies is gesturing towards the use of new types of relational concepts as a critical lens and as a lever to reframe museums, heritage collections and institutions, and practices as social material assemblages and human material extended networks, particularly in archaeology. And this includes my work, but also Tony Bennett, Rodney Harrison, Emma Waterton, who's going to be here next week, Dennis Byrne, and many others. Now, ecologizing work on human subject-object distinctions in collecting and documentation can be used to formulate new concepts for material culture as heterogeneous social material compositions. Rework objects and artworks as vibrant or lively, opposed to static objective things, and as part of more diverse, dynamic social collectives. Multinaturalism, Vivero de Castro's notion, can be used to rework cultural diversity as a diversity of natures and a diversity of entities that include non-human others, thus breaking the culture-nature and self-other division. Ecologizing principles can be also directed towards the revision of one-world ontologies and replace them with concepts that allow institute or museum professionals to compose multiple divergent worlds, to negotiate different realities and co-produce shared worlds through documentation practices and exhibition narratives between different groups. Such ecologizing experimentations can therefore provide an empirical and theoretical case to support the argument that museum projects can, through the recognition of more than human social collectives and the blending of different ontologies, together make an important contribution to producing knowledge that can promote a long-term sort of habitability discourses and strategies for action. Ecologizing experimentations on natural history collections and exhibition narratives have the potential more broadly to rework human-focused and hubris perceptions of the world, build new social collectives that can acknowledge the work with the inter and complementary relations between humans and non-humans, and promote concepts of social inclusion and an ethics of care for beyond the human world, as a new position from which interspecies transactions can be made. Now, my first experiment was to refashion institutions as liquid, and Bauman uses the term liquid for a lot of his work in the early 2000s, but I'm using that term in a much more ontological way. So I was motivated to do this work by the research I'd done on the roles and agencies of museums in climate change engagement, and how we can think about institutions as agential in global networks and multi-stakeholder alliances, including that of the non-human. Inspired by Deleuze and Guattari and Delander's assemblages, I ontologically refashioned the museum's agency as an institutional form, as a series of heterogeneous assemblages made up of material and expressive forms enmeshed in diverse collectives and comprising many human and non-human elements. So as an assemblage, the Liquid Museum is distributed. It's multi and interscalar, crossing sectors, scales and transnational boundaries. The institution is comprised of a series of components that are mobile, cohere with others, and also disperse or disassemble according to certain conditions and events. Change, therefore, becomes a rhizomic process, both intended and unintended, in which agency is rethought in terms of relational resources and institutional capacities. So by thinking about institutions in these terms, museums emerge as more nimble, flexible and adaptive, better able to meaningfully engage topics within multi-stakeholder collectives or polycentric governance for collective action on topics from global environmental change, and to consider institutional roles in broader political and media ecologies. Now, the second experiment was on the narratives in atmosphere, climate change at the Science Museum in London. Here I illustrated how we might compose climate change narratives and action differently in ways that signal our embeddedness in a climate changed world. So here I suggested ways that we might collapse and then individuate big nature, the atmosphere, society and science into an array of coordinates, some of whom were previously invisible, and rework the relationships between all these things as natural cultural hybrids. So these ontologies that I developed here also gesture towards ways in which linear notions of cause and effect inherent in mitigation and stabilisation narratives can be reworked as non-linear complex systems involving the actions and agencies of many more human, non-human, technological actors and earthly processes. So what I did was extend the range of the coordinates that we think about in climate change narratives. Now my third experiment, which I'm going to spend more time talking about, settles on Museum Victoria's Black Saturday bushfire collection. Now the Black Saturday bushfires of the 7th of February 2009 was Australia's most devastating natural disaster. The firestorm was equivalent to 500 Hiroshima atomic bombs in its intensity. 173 people died, 3,400 homes were lost, 43,000 acres of land was razed, 11,000 farm animals killed, more than 1 million native fauna, and vital community infrastructure also disappeared. And the environmental impacts were catastrophic. Now, Killian Fitzpatrick from Marysville took this image through his kitchen window at 6:55 p.m. on that fateful Saturday evening. The fire had already spent half an hour burning the Fitzpatrick's backyard. But luckily they escaped with their cats, but sadly lost their home and all their possessions. The Black Saturday Bushfire Collection, which was developed by Lisa Dale Hazlitt, who's one of the curators at the museum, at the Melbourne Museum, you could actually view it as something lowly and uninteresting, rubbish left after a raging fire. But they also invoke the uncanny, things that are everyday but strangely familiar, and this is the Freudian notion of the uncanny. But yet they're incongruous, transformed in ways that confound, disturb and surprise. So their uncanniness is their new form, their new context. So we've got a bag of white ash that used to be Bob Coppinger's tax files, and this is his pile of tax files, which he made a joke about, all his tax problems disappeared. A tape measure and decking plank recovered from a property at Mount Disappointment. The burnt out shell of a Holden 48215 sedan, part of Chris Lee's vintage car collection, which was housed on his property, Cunanalla. The curator, Lisa Dale Hallett, developed this collection from these sites to record the impact of the bushfires on communities and the emergency response. So here the curatorial emphasis was on the human experience, where objects representing the fragility of life, the depth of loss, the miracle of survival, and also the ferocity of the fire. But these collections are much more than things to represent human life and concerns. Even the love of vintage cars, the annual bureaucratic practice of tax income returns, and the Australian obsession with house renovation. even the ferocity of fire in human stories. But they can be put to work in other ways to illustrate how all these things, as the emergent consequences and effects of contingent and heterogeneous enactments and performances comprising a gathering of human and non-human actants in bushfire events. And I use as my example here a melted, distorted green plastic bucket. So the bucket is representative of the dramatic interface between the worlds of humans, more than humans, and other than humans, as an exemplar of the unfolding of this bushfire event. The remains of the bucket and its mangled spout can trigger ecological thinking. By promoting ways of thinking with the bucket rather than thinking about the bucket as representative of human struggle, we can acknowledge our radical coexistence and interconnectivity with the other than human world. So the green plastic bucket is framed around Bill Putt's accounts of survival, where the bucket is used to recall and recite his last-ditch attempts to save his house, Rosewood, at Stranwethen, from the impending furnace. Now, Bill was a well-known blues musician and bass player in the band Spectrum in the 1970s. And he shows his house, I'm just going to show you a video of this. He shows his house Rosewood before and after the disastrous fires of February 7th, accompanied by before and after versions of the song he wrote for his partner Rosemary. And this is where the bucket plays a very important role. So the collection's record that describes the object is a green plastic garden bucket mounted on one side and missing the handle. The spout is still visible. Traces of dried mud adhere to the surface. So while the bucket's curatorial interpretation acknowledges the subjectivities of the event and a description gestures towards its materiality and form, these human subject-orientated frames promote the bucket as a static representation in the service of the human social. So untying human subject-based understandings of the bucket as a bounded object and as an artefact requires its rescription in more than human terms as thingness and as composition. The attribution of thingness is reminiscent of Heidegger's proposition that our being in the world is of a thingy nature. That is, things are not separate from us, rather things all function in relationship to each other. I have, however, reworked Heidegger's thingy world to that of a more radical reading of thingness to refer to the bucket as an extended and dispersed spatial and temporal thing made up of conative and ontologically diverse vital elements. I also reframe the bucket as a composition to refer to its distributed performativity, incorporating material, discursive, social, scientific, human, non-human, natural and cultural elements. So my first task in its ontological refashioning is to rework the humanisms that hold the bucket's objecthood and interpretation in place. So disrupting these normal humanisms and the agential relationships organised around Bill, his experiences and actions that currently underlay our understanding of the green plastic bucket necessitates the disassembling of these relationships and their reconstitution into a diverse list of coordinates that represents the bundles of material, semiotic, conceptual, social, emotional components and ecological elements that make up its distributed composition. So this assortment of connate things is not only Bill Putt, his bodily actions and his stories, but also the bucket's materials, processes of production, its geographical location, its extended histories from the deep past, to its museological ascription and its material non-human features and form. So to this end, the list comprises plastic, carbon, hydrogen, oil, coal, polymers, mud, fire, moulds, digital code, climate change, temperature, wind speed, strange weather in Victoria on the 7th of February 2009, a mud brick house, a failed water pump, 2 curators, collection managers, documentation procedures and so forth, some of whom are not visible within the formal object description. So from this ontologically diverse list of connate elements, Bill and his subjectivities just become one of many of the actants that intermingle with each other. The list also operates as a mechanism for reascribing each of its components as actants or vital, lively things. So this task reworks agency away from the human to acknowledge the bucket's multiple agencies, including its materialities, physical form and multifarious discursive and affective framings. So in order to attribute agencies and affordances to each of the bucket's elements, such as, for example, biological, elemental, fire, ecological processes, technological and technical processes, human elements, thought such as fear. I draw on literature in the posthumanities, for example, the work of Donna Haraway, Rossi Braidotti and Ian Hodder, in particular, and also Jane Bennett in the New Materialisms, but also relevant technical, scientific and historical information. For example, the plastic in which the bucket is made comprises a series of tight independencies from its historical genealogy, such as the development of plastic, its human actants, such as civil engineers, and its sequences of production from its materials, carbon, oil, polymer, to molten plastic, pressure and injection moulding. So by gathering together these actants that make up its composition and reassembling them in new types of relations, we can consider the performative effects of their interdependencies and affordances overall as a distributed agency. So with the primary elemental agency of fire, for example, its affordances, including its physical and chemical properties, operates as a series of tight independencies that exhibit different temporalities, clusterings, tautness, and enabling effects that cohere around in certain ways around the bucket. For example, temperatures in the 40s on that day, climate changes and agency afforded by humans interacting with other affordances such as wind speed, the potential for rapid oxidation and combustion of the Australian bush, the release of heat, light, burning embers and smoke that enabled the Kilmore fire, East fire to emerge and converge on Bill Putt's property and the bucket. This sequence locked in a series of other folded and entangled and embedded relations, a failed water pump, the bucket's form and spout as an affordance to hold and pour water, to put out the encroaching fire, to the chemical composition of plastic combined with radical radiant heat and its molten effects. Bill's fear of loss, of dying livestock, of burning buildings and the act of running. So given all this, the composition, the green plastic bucket is no longer a static thing, rather it emerges through multiple locations and the effect of its distribution across many lively actants as part of more diverse dynamic social collectives and extended networks. Its solidity acts as a stand-in for its distributed actants and the agencies that make up the bucket. So by considering the bucket as thingness and its composition and a description of its elements, materials and stories attribute to it as actants and the term performativity to describe the interaction of these actants, allows us to move beyond, as an extended and network composition, allows us to move beyond the social construct of the object, artefact and collection. So where conventional terms promoted a sole focus on social and cultural conventions of language, describing, naming and narrating histories and personal accounts as bounded objects, these new terms gesture towards their relational reconfiguration. The shift of social subjectivity from the human to include the non-human world through the attribution of each of the object's elements as actants and the many ways these relational subjects are entangled and folded together also better illustrate the animated relationships we have to life in general. So this interaction of these multiple relational subjects also constitute collective forms of social agency that promote new understandings of history as emergent from within these more than human collectives. The composition also promotes new forms of civic life and sociality to include animate and inanimate things comprising the technology of the bucket, materials, trees, climatic systems, humans and discourses. So this more inclusive vision of a shared world has the potential to promote enhanced respect and ethical concern for diversity of both animate and inanimate things, nourish new forms of interspecies connections and other modes of thought and concepts in ways that more closely approximate the complexities of life itself. Within the museum context, new post-human collections research and documentation procedures have the potential to support the analysis and description of objects as things in social material compositions. And these practices could include, first of all, the detailing of the actants that make up the extended composition in the field, but also while acknowledging that you can't always gain an understanding of some elements because they can't be known until they're performed, or you may not know at all. There are multiple agencies, sequences, interdependencies, entanglements, interactions, spatial and temporal dimensions. And the third is the cartographic mapping of the movement of these actants as representative of their performativity as emergent processes. And I'm suggesting this is a new way of documenting collections. So to conclude, my approach to rethinking collections incorporates the human experience, but it's not all about the human. It renders the bucket, for example, capable in encounters with different actants. And this is one of the things that Donna Haraway says about interspecies connections. But also illustrating the dense material semiotic, elemental, technical becoming of itself in the bushfire event, in which humans are just one element. The remnants of the bucket spout triggers ecological thoughts that can help us think with and act in radical coexistence. So by reworking the object and conventions of describing, narrating histories and personal accounts and reframing them this way, things like the bucket can be put to work to illustrate the lively interdependencies between humans' practices, decisions, and the multivarious animate and inanimate things and materialities. For example, the Australian bush fire, metal, plastic, heat, wind, technology, CO2, human acts, and so forth, that can improve our understanding of bushfires as entangled in emergent processes. Now finally, Bill did indeed save his house and his life. However, he lost several outbuildings on his property and livestock to the fire. And I'll just show you the after. This paper was published in the Posthuman Glossary. Rossi Braidotti's, I can't remember, Maria's book that came out a couple of months ago. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.